everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know how much we love to dig into the unexpected, and today we're tackling a topic that's both fascinating and really important. We're going to look at how people respond when disaster strikes, specifically after a major earthquake.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shift for us. We're usually sifting through obscure historical texts or economics reports, but today's source material is actually mobile phone data.
I know, right? It's like a whole new way of understanding human behavior. And this is the cool part. We're using this data to track migration patterns after the 2014 Ludian earthquake in southwest China. So basically, we're seeing where people went and how quickly they moved, all thanks to their phones.
You hit the nail on the head. We're talking near real-time insights into how a major natural disaster can reshape a population, at least in the short term. And for you listening, this deep dive is all about answering two big questions. First, did the earthquake cause a significant exodus of people from the affected area? And second, did it trigger a reverse migration, with people who had previously left coming back to help?
And we're not just going to throw out some numbers and stats. We're going to walk you through the whole story, step by step. We'll unpack how the researchers gathered this data, what they discovered, and what it all means for understanding how communities cope with these kinds of events.
And here's a little spoiler alert. The findings are pretty striking. We'll see a clear and immediate surge of people moving out of the earthquake zone, but the return migration, well, that's a different story. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's set the scene.
Right. Context is everything. So let's rewind back to August 3rd, 2014. That's when the Ludian earthquake hit. And it was a big one, a magnitude 6.1.
It was devastating. To give you an idea of the impact, it was the deadliest earthquake in China since 2010, with a tragic loss of over 700 lives and billions of dollars in damage. It affected over 1 million people, mostly in an area called Zhaotong Prefecture in Yunnan province.
And it's important to remember Zhaotong is a relatively low-income area. So this earthquake hit a region that was already facing economic challenges, adding another layer of complexity to the whole situation.
Now, this is where the mobile phone data enters the picture. The researchers used daily records from China Mobile, which, as you might know, is a huge telecommunications company in China. In 2013, they held a whopping 62% market share.
I remember struggling to even find a SIM card that wasn't China Mobile when I traveled there. They're everywhere, especially in rural areas. But hold on, how do you actually track migration with phone data?
It all comes down to something called roaming. You've probably experienced it yourself while traveling. It's basically when your phone, which has a SIM card registered in one location, connects to a network in a different location.
So like when I went hiking in the mountains and my phone was desperately trying to cling to any signal it could find.
Exactly. The researchers specifically looked at roaming activity between Zhaotong Prefecture and Guangdong province. They tracked the number of phones registered in Zhaotong that were active in Guangdong, and vice versa.
So if someone from Zhaotong traveled to Guangdong and used their phone, their roaming activity would flag them as potentially having migrated, at least temporarily.
Precisely. It's a pretty clever way to capture those short-term movements. Now, a quick caveat. This method is really good for tracking initial decisions and movements in the weeks and months after the earthquake, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about permanent relocation.
Makes sense. People tend to switch to a local SIM card if they're staying in a new place for a longer period, so we're getting a snapshot of those immediate responses, not the long-term picture. But why focus on Guangdong specifically? What's so special about that province?
Well, Guangdong is kind of like the economic engine of China. It's a major manufacturing hub and a huge draw for migrant workers from rural areas. Back in 2012, there was something like 52 million migrant workers in the Pearl River Delta area alone, a massive proportion of the national total.
So it's like the place to go if you're looking for work, especially if you're coming from a less developed area like Zhaotong.
Exactly. And we know there are typical migration patterns associated with Guangdong. For instance, there's usually a big spike in roaming numbers right after Chinese New Year and during the summer school holidays.
Those are the times when migrant workers are heading back to their jobs or taking breaks, right?
Exactly. And on the flip side, the numbers usually dip just before the Chinese New Year. So we've got this established pattern of seasonal movement to and from Guangdong.
Okay, so we've got the backdrop. A major earthquake in a less affluent area with existing patterns of migration to a booming economic center. Now, let's get to the heart of it. What did the mobile phone data reveal about how people moved after the earthquake?
Here's where it gets really interesting. To really isolate the earthquake's impact, the researchers used a super smart statistical method called the synthetic control method. Imagine they created a virtual twin of Zhaotong, but one that wasn't affected by the earthquake.
So like a parallel universe where the earthquake never happened?
Kind of. They built this synthetic Zaotong by taking a weighted average of other similar prefectures that weren't hit. This allowed them to compare the actual migration patterns in Zaitong with what would have likely happened if the earthquake hadn't occurred. It's like controlling for all those other factors that could influence migration.
So it's about zeroing in on the earthquake's unique effect on people's movement.
Precisely. And what they found was a clear and sustained increase in people moving out of Zaotong and into Guangdong, starting within weeks of the earthquake and continuing for months. If you look at Figure 2 in the study, you can actually see this visually. There's a widening gap after the earthquake between the number of phones roaming from Zaotong to Guangdong and the number roaming from the unaffected synthetic Zaotong. It's a pretty compelling visual representation of the earthquake's impact.
Okay, so people were definitely leaving the earthquake zone. But how big was this exodus? Did they quantify it?
They did. The peak of this outward migration happened about 14 weeks after the earthquake. At that point, they estimated that there were roughly 1,900 more phones from Zaotong active in Guangdong each day than they would have expected based on their synthetic control.
That's a pretty substantial increase. But how do you go from counting phones to counting people? It's not like every person who migrated took their phone with them.
Right. You're right. There's a bit of detective work involved. To figure out how many actual people were on the move, they conducted a survey in Guangzhou. They asked migrants from the earthquake-affected areas how long it took them to switch from their original SIM card to a local Guangdong SIM card.
Makes sense. So they were trying to figure out how quickly people were ditching their old numbers after arriving in Guangdong.
Exactly. And what they found is that it was a gradual process. About 30% switched within the first week, another 19% within 1 to 2 weeks, and so on. The slowest group, about 8.5%, took over 2 months to switch. Using this pattern, they estimated that each migrant from Zaotong increased the daily roaming phone count by about 25.2 on average over time.
So they could use that number to translate the increase in roaming phones into an estimate of the actual number of people migrating.
You got it. Based on their calculations, they estimated that roughly 13,000 Zaotong residents moved to Guangdong in the 6 months following the earthquake. To put that in perspective, that's about 1.3% of the population estimated to have been affected by the quake.
That's a significant chunk of people. But how can we be sure this wasn't just some random fluctuation in the data?
That's a valid question. To make sure the increase wasn't just a fluke, they ran some statistical tests called permutation tests. These tests basically check if the observed results could have happened by chance.
Like flipping a coin a bunch of times and seeing if you get heads way more often than you'd expect.
Yeah, kind of like that.
Ah.
And what these tests showed was that the increase in outmigration was statistically significant, meaning it was very unlikely to have happened by random chance. This was especially true for the first 4 months after the earthquake and when looking at the overall effect over the 6-month period.
So we have strong evidence that the earthquake triggered a wave of people leaving the affected area and heading to a major economic hub like Guangdong. Makes sense, right? In the aftermath of a disaster, people might be looking for stability and opportunities elsewhere. But what about those who had already left Zaotong before the earthquake? Did they come back to help with the recovery?
Now this is where things get really interesting. The researchers wanted to see if there was a reverse migration, with people coming back to Zaotong after the earthquake. So they used a similar synthetic control approach, but this time they looked at the number of phones registered in Guangdong that were roaming in Zaotong.
So they were trying to see if there was a sudden influx of people with Guangdong SIM cards showing up in the earthquake zone.
Exactly. And the results were quite surprising. They found no statistically significant evidence of a large-scale return migration. The only exception was a small, temporary blip around the Chinese New Year in 2015.
Yeah, the study mentions a figure A3, that shows this pretty clearly. The number of Guangdong phones roaming in Zaotong basically followed the same pattern as the synthetic control after that initial post-earthquake period. So apart from that brief New Year spike, which could just be normal holiday travel, there wasn't a wave of people returning to Zaotong.
Exactly. So you have this significant outflow of people leaving, but not a corresponding inflow of those who had previously left.
It's almost like the pull of economic opportunity in Guangdong was stronger than the pull of going back home to help, even after such a devastating event.
That's a really key takeaway. It seems that the immediate need for family support or reconstruction wasn't the driving factor in migration decisions. Instead, it looks like longer-term economic prospects were more influential.
And the fact that the peak outmigration happened around 3 months after the earthquake might suggest that this was the time when people were able to assess the damage and make those longer-term decisions about their future.
That's a plausible interpretation. It seems that the earthquake's impact on people's economic prospects and their perception of those prospects played a significant role in their migration choices.
This reminds me of a study on Typhoon Ketsana in Vietnam. They also found an increase in outmigration for work after the disaster.
That's right. And even though they used a different method, a difference in differences approach, the overall trend is consistent. It seems that economic factors are a recurring theme in how people respond to natural disasters.
It's fascinating how consistent these findings are across different disasters and contexts. Now, the researchers do acknowledge that there are some nuances to consider when interpreting this mobile phone data. For example, some of those phones roaming from Zhaotong into Guangdong might have belonged to people who were seeking temporary shelter with relatives or friends, not necessarily economic migrants.
That's a valid point. It's always important to be mindful of the limitations of any data source. But here's the thing. The researchers also argue that this type of data can capture something that traditional surveys often miss:
What's that?
whole household movements. Traditional surveys often focus on individuals who were in the area before the disaster. So if an entire family moves, they might not be captured in follow-up surveys. But mobile phone data can pick up those larger-scale movements.
That's a really interesting point. So this data could actually provide a more comprehensive picture of migration patterns than traditional methods in some cases.
Exactly. And it all comes back to the power of using unconventional data sources to understand human behavior. In this case, mobile phone data has given us a really unique and timely glimpse into how people responded to a major disaster.
It's like having a real-time window into how a community adapts and copes with a huge disruption. And it's all thanks to those little devices we carry around in our pockets.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. We can now track these kinds of population shifts almost as they happen, giving us a much more dynamic and nuanced understanding of how people react to major events.
So to sum it all up for you, our deep dive into the aftermath of the 2014 Ludian earthquake, seen through the lens of mobile phone data, reveals a fascinating story. There was a significant and rapid movement of people out of the affected area, but not a corresponding wave of people returning. And it seems that economic considerations played a big role in those migration choices.
The fact that we didn't see a significant return migration, even after such a devastating event, really highlights how important economic factors are in shaping people's responses to these kinds of crises. It's a reminder that recovery isn't just about rebuilding physical structures, it's also about rebuilding livelihoods and economic stability.
And the way we were able to track these shifts using something as simple as mobile phone data is a real eye-opener. It shows how unconventional data sources can give us incredibly valuable insights into human behavior, especially in times of crisis.
And for you, the listener, this raises some fascinating questions to ponder. What other kinds of societal changes or events could we better understand by analyzing these digital footprints we all leave behind? What other questions about how societies function and evolve could this type of data help us answer? It's a whole new world of discovery waiting to be explored.
So keep those questions in mind, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the unexpected.
Until then.
Bye, everyone.